Oh, 20 minutes after 6, if you've just walked in the door, a very good evening to you. Good to have you with us here on South Africa Tonight. Stage 6 blackouts, I'm afraid, is what you've come home to as well, in place until early tomorrow morning. Well, let's stay with energy issues, and South Africa is in desperate need of energy. We all know that. Here's a case in point where we're sitting this evening, you and I. Well, the Institute of Race Relations has warned against environmentalists appealing against Eskom bypassing pollution rules at Kusile power station. While the organisation is saying, while the potential health effects are valid concerns, there are broader implications of these decisions that South Africans need to be concerned and need to be considered in this discussion. I'm joined by the IRR Head of Strategic Communications, Mr. Hermann Pretorius, this evening. Hermann, good evening to you, and I appreciate your time. And we always knew we were going to get to a point where we could be burning as much coal as we want. We can keep the lights on, but there's the environmental side on this as well. Tell me about your stance. Where are you on this?
So I think South Africa is currently sort of like a patient in cardiac arrest. One might ask questions about the lifestyle, the diet of the patient in question, but those questions only become relevant once you get the patient's heart beating again under, the immense stressful circumstances of immediate crisis. And stage 6 being introduced again just goes to show that we should really focus on getting energy flowing into the power grid. And we also need to be honest about the fact that there are no such things as solutions, only trade-offs. And what we might win from one solution, we might lose in another. And to think that avoidance of coal-powered generation is sufficient to protect our environment and the healthcare of perhaps especially the most vulnerable South Africans misses the wood for the trees and perhaps the paraffin for the stove.
Yeah, I'm so glad you used the wood for the trees there, because I was going to go environmental here for a moment. What you've got is you've got a head-to-head, don't you, Hermann? We either want energy or we want to save the environment. I made this comment a few weeks ago. I wish it was different. In another world, another country, we could have it both ways, but we can't. It's energy versus the environment, isn't it?
At least in the short term.
Sure.
If we look at where energy and environmental concerns are most in sync, it is in post-industrialized nations where you have the infrastructure economically and socially to ensure that your fuel resources aren't taken in an unsustainable way from nature, as often happens in South Africa. We have many parts of South Africa where chopping down a tree for heat, for warmth, for boiling water, for bathing, for cooking, quite often are the only option for people out there. So to then understand or to then look at the situation and say, if only we can get away from coal, the environmental impact will be minimized, misses the point that, yes, coal isn't environmentally perfect, but it also isn't the case that any other solution is perfect as well. And if we look at the health concerns as well, we can look at studies showing that wood-burnt particulate is just as dangerous in some cases as the particulate released from coal burning.
Let's talk about the legal aspect of this for a moment, the real reason you and I are actually talking. So there's a warning against environmentalists appealing Eskom bypassing pollution rules. So there are pollution rules for Eskom, whether it's X many cubic meters of emission, whatever that might be. I'm sure someone smarter than me can use the right terms, but there's a warning against appealing this. Is that correct? Are you warning against a legal appeal on this? What is that trying to achieve?
So in terms of the Quality Care Act, Section 59, there can be an exemption made for circumstances exactly like this, where environmental protection regulations with regards to air quality can be bypassed. And in March this year, Minister Barbara Creecy, in terms of the Act, allowed such an exemption for this temporary expansion of Kusile's generational capacity for 2023 to 2025, adding over 2,000 megawatts and reducing possibly 2 stages of load shedding for the country. So this is massive stuff. These consequences are immense. And I am always hesitant when regulations allow government entities or state-owned entities to bypass some restrictions. But I think we have to be pragmatic in these circumstances and say, look, the law has been followed. The patient needs a beating heart.
And that beating heart aside as well, there's conditions that go with recovery in a case like this. You've had triple bypass surgery. I'll use your analogy. You've had a heart operation. There's a triple bypass surgery. There is recovery in this case. And I imagine that's what environmentalists want to hear this evening from you. Is there a middle ground, or is this, let's try and fix it after the fact?
I think really in the short term, it is just getting power flowing into the grid.
Yeah.
Because if we are going to look at this in a medium to longer term framework, that is then when we can say, right, we have now come out of crisis. What's the sustainable way from navigating permanently away from crisis? An analogy I heard the other day is similar to saying, look, if we shut down our economy, but we protect our environment, our kids will go hungry with very beautiful plates on the table. We need to prioritize the ability of putting food on the table. And at the end of the day, that's what the economy is about.
I don't think many people would disagree about the damage the economy is taking, Hermann, on this, but I do need to ask you the question. So right now, you and I are talking about coal. Next, we're going to have fracking in the Karoo for oil and other natural resources. Next minute, you and I are sitting here talking about let's build a few more nuclear power plants as well. I suppose the issue is here scale and regulation. Where do you stop the cart on this one?
Well, I think the law provides a clear framework, and the law was followed in this instance. Section 59 of the Quality Air Act was followed. Minister Creasy acted in terms of that law. We haven't thrown the baby out with the bathwater here.
Yeah.
This is perhaps not ideally where we want to be, but the law allows for such emergency circumstances and such bypass. And especially if we look at the alternatives for not doing this, is inflicting immense harm on our economy or applying a handbrake when we really need to put down the foot on the accelerator. And also, we mustn't forget that the health risks of paraffin stoves and wood stoves, the alternatives that especially the poorest South Africans will use in the absence of electricity, also bears significant health and environmental risks.
Let me ask you this in closing. So when do you stop? When we get to, not you, I understand you're talking about regulation that's currently in place. I don't mean to infer it's you, but when do we as a country stop? When we get to a manageable stage 2, a manageable stage 1, no blackouts for 6 months. What's the measurement of success? I'm going to use an executive term. What's the ROI? When do we decide, okay, enough is enough?
When we have a stable power supply. Now, that is a much larger conversation than just environmental concerns versus economic or energy concerns. We strongly and urgently need a competitive market to have an all-of-the-above approach in terms of energy. If we can have MTN and Vodacom and Cell C competing for cell phone availability and the coverage and the service of that, and we never suffer from the shedding of data or connectivity issues, because there's this competition that if you have trouble with Vodacom, you can go to MTN and vice versa. The problem with a monopoly like Eskom is the competition incentive for improvement isn't there. So I would say in the short term, let's get the patient's heart beating. Let's get the law, or let's stick to the law where exemptions are possible. But then in the medium to long term, let's open up that energy market. Let's make it possible for the ingenuity of South Africa's entrepreneurs to come up with energy solutions, and rehabilitate Eskom to be that fail-safe for where the market might not always be cost effective.
Yeah, it's a very clever analogy. Let me use the word triage in a case like this as well, if we're talking about beating hearts and all that. Hermann, thank you very much indeed for making time for me this evening. Hermann Pretorius, Institute for Race Relations, Head of Strategic Communications, making time for us this evening. So it's environmental versus energy. We can call it what it is, but that's what it comes down to at the moment. More power for the country at the risk of saving our environment, and we know we're going to be hearing from environmental experts and activists. It's conservation versus convenience.